Between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Los Angeles Lakers, we currently have a 1-1 playoff series. Minnesota came out game 1, they were hungry, and they made a statement against the Lakers, but in game 2, LA responded. And it looks like we may have a great playoff series ahead of us, one that we don't just remember now and have fun with now, but we can look back on in a few years and still think of memorable moments and incredible performances both individually and as a team. Let's break it down on State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. Now, to begin, the first thing that really stands out with this series to me is the exigency of it. Now, exigence is kind of this urge or this demand to get something accomplished, and it motivates an individual to go out and do something because of the circumstances around them that they feel compelled to do something. And come the NBA postseason, for every team, there is the exigence of wanting to win a title. But the best teams, the best players, and the best moments are created when that exigence goes a little bit further. And it does exactly that for this series between Minnesota and LA. Starting off with LA, you have LeBron James, of course. This is someone who is widely regarded as a top 2 player in the history of the NBA. And at this point, with the legacy that he has set forth for himself, he is not going to lose that spot, but instead he wants to jump up. He wants to be the solidified number 1. And perhaps that may never happen. There will always be discussions, there will always be quarrels about the MJ versus LeBron debate. But for LeBron, adding a 5th ring to his resume, beating Minnesota in round 1, and going on to add championship number 5, that strengthens his argument just a little bit more. Because one of the biggest arguments in Jordan's favor against LeBron is the fact that Michael Jordan has 6 rings while LeBron has 4. And if one was able to just make that difference a little bit smaller, then that would be a major boost to LeBron's legacy and put him just about on par with Jordan, especially considering the amount of finals appearances he has. Some view that as a pro, some view it as a negative. But getting him to 5 would catapult him even more to greatest of all time status. And when you are someone like LeBron or Jordan, everything can and will be used as motivation. That's what makes the greatest the greatest. There is constantly that search for a chip on their shoulder so that they are motivated and they always have that competitive fire and that desire to be the best. That is absolutely active within LeBron James right now. But to be the best, you have to move on. You can't lose in round 1. So there's absolutely exigence in the mind of LeBron James. Then we get to his co-star in Luka Doncic. And for Luka, he is dealing with 2 different kinds of exigence. The first one is a little bit reactionary. The first one is the emotional exigence of Luka Doncic. And that is likely that he wants to prove the Dallas Mavericks and GM Nico Harrison wrong about moving on from him. This was a move that shook the landscape of the entire NBA. And there is absolutely a chip on Luka Doncic's shoulder from it. He came out the other day and said that he had thrown his phone when he found out he got traded. And he still keeps that phone. And it might be a little bit cracked, but it's a reminder of what happened to him. And there's absolute reactionary and emotional exigence for Luka to prove Dallas wrong. But in the grand scheme of things, there's also exigence in regards to his place in the NBA. Because this is a solidified top 5 range of player. But because he has not yet won an NBA championship, there are still question marks within some circles about his ability to win at the highest level. Last year was the closest we've ever seen so far for Doncic, but they still didn't get it done at the very top of the mountain. And so for Doncic, he likely wants to prove himself in the face of the rest of the NBA as a complete and utter winning player. And should we become undeniably, because there is still criticism to be had about Luka. There's criticism to be had about his defense, his conditioning per the Mavericks. But when you show and you display that you can win, and not just win, but be an integral part on a championship winning team, all those conversations change, and you're catapulted to conversations about perhaps being the best that the league has to offer. You want an example of that? Look at Nikola Jokic. When he had gotten his first MVP, but had not yet won a championship. There were question marks about if he deserved that MVP, and looking at his production, it was very, very impressive. But there were doubts, especially from major analysts like Stephen A. Smith, about his impact. But in winning a title a few years later, he put those to silence, and now he's largely recognized as one of, if not the best, basketball player in the entire world. So there is emotional exigence for Luka, as well as exigence in regards to his role and his positioning and the way he is perceived in NBA circles. Then we move on to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and one player to really highlight here is Julius Randle. This is someone who has been a noted playoff dropper his entire career, really. And with that, there's always a stigma around you. No matter what you do in the regular season, Julius Randle is a two-time All-NBA team member. No matter what you do in the regular season, if you do not execute in the playoffs, if your efficiency and your production drops off to the level that it did for Randle, then no matter what contributions you make in the regular season, you are always going to be devalued because teams don't necessarily trust you in the playoffs. Look at D'Angelo Russell, someone who for years was a really solid regular season player for the Lakers, but because he continually had declined in the playoffs, they were not afraid at all to move on from him. So for Julius Randle to try to prove himself in the playoffs, he just had the highest scoring game of his playoff career recently. That came in this series. So it seems evident that there's a desire from Randle to kind of break that narrative and break out of the box of perhaps a good regular season player, but one you can't trust in the playoffs. And to become a more trustworthy player and perhaps be someone that Timberwolves they decide they want to keep around. Then you get to the head coaches on both sides, and I think there's a lot of exigence between both Chris Finch and JJ Redick. Starting off with Chris Finch, because we just talked about Randle. We'll continue on with the Minnesota theme. Chris Finch, by the numbers, is one of the best coaches Minnesota has ever had. Because for years, there were question marks about Chris Finch and kind of his roster decisions, especially rotation-wise with the young guys. It seemed like no matter the circumstances, even if a veteran was not playing up to par, Finch kind of had a tendency to kind of brush it off and not play the young guys. There wasn't necessarily a lot of trust there between the coach and the young, still developing players. Guys like Wendell Moore, Josh Minott, and Leonard Miller come to mind as these players that were seen as having some kind of potential, and maybe that's, not necessarily a full-time starter, not necessarily an all-star, but potential to contribute. And there was a push from Timberwolves fans to bring these players into the lineup and just give them some minutes here and there. Just anything for the young guys to prove themselves and develop in real time on the NBA court. And Finch this year has kind of largely responded to that, and he's allowed guys like Rob Dillingham and Jalen Clark just a little bit looser of a leash and given them a little bit more responsibility and a bigger role than he had for some young players in the past. So we've seen a response from Chris Finch to potential exigence from outside fans and maybe the organization. And I think that comes into this playoff series as well, because in spite of Chris Finch being one of the better Minnesota Timberwolves head coaches that we've ever seen, in the NBA, as a head coach, you're always on the hot seat. Look at a guy like Michael Malone or Taylor Jenkins of the Memphis Grizzlies. No matter what you've done in the past, it is a what have you done for me lately league. And continually, more and more, it seems like teams, they want success immediately, and they want success annually. So for Chris Finch, especially with prior kind of question marks about his rotational decisions, there's absolutely a desire and an exigence for Chris Finch to execute well, come up with good schemes, and utilize the players on his roster to the best of his ability. Then for the Lakers, it's pretty similar when glancing at the job market for a head coach in JJ Redick. Like I was with Chris Finch, for JJ Redick, it's much of the same in the sense that head coaches have to have their backs backed at all times. They are going to be scapegoated. They are going to be criticized for every mistake that they make. And when the team does well, that largely is put on the players. But when the team performs badly, that is so often put on the head coach. So for JJ Redick, there is a desire to prove himself as a first-year head coach with no proper coaching pedigree. He was someone that, of course, LeBron trusted. And with that, in hiring him, the Lakers organization, they took a little bit of a risk on him. But with that, everything he does is going to be under a microscope. That's already the case for most head coaches, but especially for Redick, because he has no real prior experience. He evidently has a great mind for the game, but how does that translate to being a head coach? How does that translate to winning at the highest level come the NBA postseason? And so for JJ Redick, a successful first playoff appearance, that would be incredible for him and his legacy and his position as an NBA head coach. So there's exigence all around on both sides and a desire to not only come out of this playoff series on top, but to win at the highest level, to reach that mountaintop, and perhaps become NBA champions. And this series is all the better for it. Then we get to the physicality. The Minnesota Timberwolves are a team with a very physical, very defensive-first identity. This is especially evident when looking at their number one option in Anthony Edwards. Oftentimes, a number one option, because of what they do on the offensive end, they are not always asked to do as much defensively. You look at a Trae Young or even a Luka Doncic, and that is usually perceived as okay. They are still very much a winning player because, at least in the case of Luka Doncic, they can still be perceived as a very much so winning player that can lead you to very good places because of everything they do for you on offense. But for Minnesota and Anthony Edwards, this team is not defined by simply what Anthony Edwards does on offense. Instead, he makes a sizable contribution defensively as well, and alongside him are some of the best defenders that the league has to offer. You have Jaden McDaniels, one of the best defenders in the entire NBA. You have Nickeil Alexander-Walker, one of the most underappreciated, most talented defenders that the league has to offer. As well as Rudy Gobert, a four-time Defensive Player of the Year, and accolade-wise, a generational kind of rim protector. Then on the perimeter, when they're out there, you've got guys like Jalen Clark and Terrence Shannon Jr. This is a team with very much a defensive identity, and so often that enables you to really set the tone. Because offensively, sometimes the shots aren't falling, right? You can scheme things perfectly, but sometimes they just aren't going. But when you have a defensive-focused identity, that really lets you set the tone early. Because as long as your guys are going out there and putting in the effort and bringing a level of intensity to their game, that hard-nosed defensive effort is always going to be present. That is going to be ubiquitous. And going up against the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Lakers have a little bit less of a defensive identity. They are more focused offensively. Now, LeBron, ever since the addition of Luka Doncic, has seemingly put more of an emphasis on his defense, but largely at this point in his career, both him and Luka Doncic, the core two of this team, are offensively focused players. Offensively focused superstars, of course, but they perhaps don't set the tone physically as in the same way that the Minnesota Timberwolves do. And that seemed to be pretty well evidenced in Game 1. Luka had a productive playoff game as usual, and LeBron wasn't terrible, but this team, they still lost by 20 to Minnesota. They were not necessarily ready for the physicality going into the series, but playoffs are all about adjustments. And in Game 2, the Lakers responded. They slowed things down a little bit. Neither team scored over 100 points, and they held Minnesota to the 80s. You can see this in some of their lineup decisions as well. Jackson Hayes is an offensively focused center, but he only played 9 minutes in Game 2. Dorian Finney-Smith, meanwhile, he played 39 minutes, and he is not necessarily someone that you put in because you want that offensive spark, the offensive firepower. He's someone you bring in for that physicality, that defensive tone, that defensive intensity. So LA, they seemingly responded to the physicality of Minnesota. And in a league where many like to state that physicality is somewhat of a lost art in the NBA, and that players today are nowhere near the level of physicality as players of yesteryear, to have a more physical playoff series with a team that on one end has a very capable defensive physical identity, and on the other end a team that is willing to respond, that physicality just makes it all the more interesting. And then we get to a little bit of the clash in styles, a little bit of the individual matchups in this series. Because no matter what happens in the regular season, when you have to win 4 games against a team to advance, matchups really, really matter. Because when you're in a series with them, this other team is continually scheming against you and actively trying to do everything that they can to stop you. So having an edge in individual matchups and certain matchups to look at can really allow one to really examine and analyze a series. As I stated with the physicality bit, for the Lakers, Jackson Hayes was really a little bit of an emerging bright spot for the Lakers. Playing alongside Luka and LeBron, they set him up for some good opportunities. And he played the most minutes per game that he has ever since the 2021-22 season. But in these last 2 games, the first 2 against Minnesota, he's played 8 and 9 minutes respectively. And that's because in this series, Jackson Hayes isn't really a needle mover for the Lakers. Because on the other end, he's matched up at that center spot against Rudy Gobert. Now, there are criticisms to be had about Rudy Gobert, but largely, when you're talking about his defense, the only issue you really have is sometimes his switchability. And not necessarily trusting him to guard smaller players, but when it comes to a big man, Rudy so often has that on lockdown. He is a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year for a reason and an elite rim protector. So for Jackson Hayes, in not doing much for the Lakers defensively, and also the potential of him being shut down by Gobert, that leaves him in a situation where he's not really able to contribute much for this team, and as a result, he has kind of been phased out in terms of getting almost 20 minutes a night like he was in the regular season, and getting a little bit under 10 in both games so far. So one thing to really look out for there is how does LA really respond to the phasing out of Hayes, and do the players that are in his place really execute? In the game 2, it really seemed like they did. Then on the perimeter, you have 2 stars who are almost diametrically opposed. On one end, you have Anthony Edwards, who is this 2-way star from Minnesota that brings a major level of defensive intensity with him, coinciding with his offensive capabilities. On the other end, you have Luka Doncic, who is one of the better offensive players that we've ever had the pleasure of truly watching. You look at his numbers, he's one of the best offensive players that we've ever seen. Not only an incredible scoring option, but a playmaking hub for the entirety of his team. And especially in joining the Lakers, so often in Dallas, Luka Doncic's game had been very heliocentric. The scheme around him had been very heliocentric in the manner in which it was largely Luka and then everybody else. But joining LA, he has had a lot of the ball handling duties, but he is still able to also be a complement to another on-ball superstar and perhaps the greatest player that we've ever seen in LeBron James. So with that, if Luka's having a bad night, it's not the end-all be-all. The Lakers have other players to respond with. And yeah, there's not too many stars in the league bigger than Ant and Luka. So on that perimeter, that is a show each and every time. And defensively, it's also about finding an answer for those two. For Anthony Edwards, through both his explosivity and his ability to shoot now, he is a very difficult player to latch onto. Then for Luka Doncic, because of his size, Anthony Edwards isn't always the best matchup for him, and we saw this in last year's playoffs. Minnesota had trouble dealing with Dallas, and specifically Luka Doncic. They would try to put Jaden McDaniels on him, but even he didn't have an answer, and McDaniels is one of the best defensive players in the entire league. So watching these two teams also try to scheme for these perimeter guards, it's going to be incredible to watch. And then for LeBron James, you also kind of have to watch out and find out a matchup for him as well. Now, LeBron is someone who has unlocked more so the shooting side of his game as he has gotten up there in age to still remain highly effective. But he's also someone who very much likes to get to his spots and drive. So with that, there's a little bit of a question mark. Do you put the bulkier Julius Randle on him, who is not known for both being a very good playoff performer as well as not necessarily the greatest defender that we've ever seen, but this is someone who has a frame to be able to handle some of what LeBron can offer if Randle is able to really apply himself and put in the effort and put in the intensity to do so. Then on the other end, though, do you want a more proven defender in the likes of a Jaden McDaniels, who may not have the physicality necessarily, the big frame to deal with LeBron, but he does have the length. as well as all the defensive talent in the world to try to stop LeBron. So there's a little bit of a question mark there as well. Regardless, there are so many interesting matchups in this series, and that makes it all the more exciting, especially for so much of the way that modern media is consumed now, especially in the sports world. It's highlights, right? And you're going to see these matchups on display, whether it's an Instagram post, a Twitter or X post, or the 10-minute highlight package that YouTube loves to put out. You're going to be seeing these individual matchups a lot and how teams respond, and that's what the playoffs are all about. You love to see it. And in conclusion, this looks to be an incredible playoff series between Minnesota and LA, especially given the parity and the level of talent that is all around the Western Conference. Despite it being the number 3 versus the number 6 seed, these two teams seem very, very much like they have all the ability in the world to take the other down and perhaps go on to even greener pastures. It's going to be an incredible series through its physicality, through individual matchups, as well as the exigence of certain players, as well as coaches and teams as a whole. Everyone feels like they have something to prove, and that makes everything even more enjoyable. And we are so lucky. It is so exciting to have a playoff series of this magnitude and the ability, the potential that this one has to be an all-time great series. Thank you very much for listening. This has been State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. I loved breaking this one down. I feel like this one was a real good example of what State of the Association has to offer. I try to kind of bridge the gap between maybe the casual audience who is really there largely for the narratives and the more diehard fans, the hardcores, who are really there for the ins and outs, the X's and O's, the nuances of the game on the court. I try to bridge that gap and bring in the psychology of the game, bring storytelling back to sports journalism, but not just in a manner of sensationalism, but instead really executing and identifying, examining the game and why it goes in certain ways. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has either been a great introduction, a great return for State of the Association. Love the way this one came out. I hope you do too. Thank you very much for listening. This has been State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. What a playoff series we have between Minnesota and LA.